Patrick Jensen, a police officer with over a decade of service in the New Haven Police Department, had a reputation. To his colleagues, he was a no-nonsense officer, always quick to enforce the law. But to those in the city's predominantly black neighborhoods, he was something else entirely, a man whose badge seemed to amplify his biases rather than suppress them. The roots of Patrick's prejudice ran deep. Growing up in a suburban town, he had been raised in an environment where people whispered stereotypes over dinner tables. His father, a retired officer himself, often spoke about those neighborhoods as though they were a war zone. For Patrick, this mindset was inherited, unexamined, and deeply ingrained. New Haven was a city divided. In the affluent districts, the streets were clean, parks were well-maintained, and police patrols were sparse. But in the poorer neighborhoods, primarily home to black and immigrant families, it was a different story. Daily patrols, stop and frisks, and subtle acts of intimidation were commonplace. Patrick thrived in this environment, justifying his actions as necessary to maintain order. On a brisk October morning, Patrick sat in his patrol car, sipping bitter coffee as he scanned the streets. His eyes landed on an elderly black man standing near a dilapidated sedan parked along a curb. The man appeared to be fiddling with something in the trunk. To Patrick, it was enough to spark suspicion. Probably stolen, Patrick muttered under his breath. He didn't need proof, his gut told him enough. Patrick parked his cruiser aggressively, tires screeching slightly as they met the curb. He stepped out, adjusting his utility belt as he approached the man. The elderly man, Samuel Carter, looked up. His face was weathered with age, deep lines etched into his dark skin. He wore a simple jacket and a knit cap, a bag of groceries resting at his feet. There was no fear in his eyes, only tiredness. As if this was not the first time he had been approached like this. "Good morning, officer," Samuel said, his voice calm and measured. "Morning," Patrick replied curtly. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Samuel raised an eyebrow. "I'm putting my groceries in my car. Is that a crime now?" Patrick's eyes narrowed. "That your car?" He gestured toward the beat-up sedan. "Yes, it is," Samuel replied, his tone steady. "I've had it for years." Patrick wasn't convinced. He walked around the car, peering into the windows as though he expected to find evidence of wrongdoing. Samuel stood silently, his hands clasped in front of him, watching the officer's every move. "Mind if I see some ID?" Patrick asked. Samuel hesitated. "Is there a reason you're asking for my ID, officer? Have I done something wrong?" Patrick's posture stiffened. "Look, I'm not here to debate. Just show me some ID." With a resigned sigh, Samuel reached into his pocket and handed over his driver's license. Patrick examined it carefully, as though expecting to find something amiss. "This address is on the other side of town," Patrick said, his tone accusatory. "And I shop here because the grocery store near my house closed down." Samuel replied, "Is that a problem?" Patrick ignored the comment. "Stay right here," he said, walking back to his cruiser to run the license through the system. As Patrick sat in the car, waiting for the system to load, a younger officer walked by. "What's going on?" she asked. "Just a routine check," Patrick replied, though his gut told him otherwise. He had no evidence, no reasonable suspicion, only the weight of his own prejudices pushing him forward. The radio crackled, confirming that Samuel Carter had no warrants and a clean record. But instead of letting the man go, Patrick decided to escalate. Returning to Samuel, Patrick handed back the ID. "What were you doing near that car before I got here?" he asked. Samuel frowned. "I told you. I was putting away my groceries." Patrick's eyes scanned the car again, looking for any excuse to justify his growing agitation. Finally, he made a decision. "Turn around." Hands on the car. Samuel blinked, his calm demeanor cracking slightly. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Hands on the car. "For what reason?" Samuel's voice rose slightly, though it remained controlled. I've done nothing wrong. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Patrick snapped. He reached for his handcuffs. A small crowd began to gather. Passers-by paused, their eyes widening at the sight of an elderly man being forced against his own car. Phones were pulled out, cameras recording every moment. Patrick ignored the murmurs, the stares, the sense of something slipping out of his control. He finished cuffing Samuel and called for a squad car to take him to the station. Samuel, his head held high, walked without resistance, though humiliation burned in his chest. At the station, Patrick continued his barrage. He mocked Samuel's old car, his worn clothes, his apparent story about groceries. Samuel said little, his dignity the only thing left intact. He requested a phone call but was denied. Patrick claimed it was protocol, though deep down, he knew it wasn't true. By the time Samuel was placed in a holding cell, Patrick felt a pang of satisfaction. To him, the elderly man was just another suspect, a small piece in the larger picture of crime he believed plagued the city. Unbeknownst to Patrick, his actions that evening had set a chain of events into motion. At home, Diane Carter, New Haven's newly elected mayor, sat at her desk, going over city budgets. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with calls and messages. Ignoring them at first, she finally answered when her secretary called directly. Mayor Carter. The voice on the other end said, strained, "You need to come to the station immediately. It's your father." Diane froze, her heart pounding. What happened? He's been arrested. The words felt surreal. Diane had grown up watching her father endure the systemic racism that seemed embedded in every facet of their lives. But she never thought it would touch him like this, not now. Not when she had fought so hard to reach a position of power. Rushing to the station, Diane felt a mixture of rage and dread. When she arrived, she demanded to see her father. The officers, visibly uncomfortable, led her to the holding cells. Samuel looked up as Diane approached, his expression softening. "Diane," he said quietly, "I'm fine." "No, you're not," she snapped, turning to the officers. "Who's responsible for this?" Patrick, hearing the commotion, stepped out from an adjacent room. "I am," he said, his voice steady. He didn't yet realize who Diane was or the magnitude of his mistake. Diane fixed him with a glare that could have cut steel. "Release him. Now." Patrick hesitated. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I said release him." Her voice echoed through the station. "And you'd better pray I don't make you regret this." As the cell door opened and Samuel was freed, Patrick began to piece together the truth. The man he had humiliated was no ordinary citizen. He was the father of the mayor. And Patrick's actions were about to bring consequences he couldn't begin to imagine. The air in the police station was heavy with tension as Diane Carter led her father, Samuel, out of the holding cell. Her sharp heels echoed against the cold, sterile tiles as every officer in the room avoided her gaze. Patrick Jensen stood rooted to the spot, trying to piece together a justification for his actions. But his mind drew blanks. "Officer Jensen." Diane's voice was cold and commanding. "A word." Patrick followed her into a nearby conference room. The door slammed shut behind him. Diane crossed her arms and fixed him with a steely glare that made him feel like a rookie on his first day. "Do you have any idea who that man is?" she began, her voice low but laced with venom. He was acting suspiciously," Patrick stammered, trying to maintain his composure. "I followed standard protocol." "Suspiciously?" Diane's voice rose. "You dragged an elderly man, my father, no less, into the station, humiliated him, and denied him basic rights. For what? Because of your gut feeling?" Patrick hesitated. He didn't know how to respond without digging himself deeper into trouble. Diane's fury only grew at his silence. "You've been on this force long enough to know better," she continued. "You have no evidence, no justification, and yet you treated him like a criminal. Do you know what this looks like? To him? To the community? To me? Patrick's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Mayor Carter, I acted within the bounds of my authority. Your authority doesn't give you the right to dehumanize people. Diane shot back. You have no idea what my father has endured in his life, and you just added to that burden. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the overhead lights. Patrick wanted to defend himself, to argue that he had done nothing wrong. But deep down, he knew her words carried weight. I'll be filing a formal complaint, Diane said, her tone icy. And trust me, Officer Jensen, this isn't over. As Diane stormed out, Patrick slumped into a chair, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. His colleagues watched in silence, their faces a mix of pity and unease. The reality of what he had done was beginning to dawn on him, but he wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. That evening, Diane brought Samuel back to her home. It was a modest house, despite her position, reflecting her commitment to living among the people she served. They sat in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows on the walls. I'm sorry, Dad, Diane said, her voice breaking slightly. I should have been there to protect you. Samuel shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. You don't need to apologize, Diane. This isn't the first time I've been treated like this. Unfortunately, it probably won't be the last. Diane's heart ached at his words. She had always admired her father's resilience, but it pained her to know he had to endure so much. Do you remember the time I was arrested in Selma? Samuel asked, his voice quiet but firm. Diane nodded. She had heard the story many times growing up. Samuel had been a young teacher then, participating in a civil rights march. He was arrested and beaten, but he never wavered in his commitment to justice. They called us troublemakers, Samuel continued. They said we didn't belong, that we were trying to destroy the fabric of society. But we didn't stop. We kept marching, kept fighting. And you know what? We made a difference. Not enough, but a difference. Diane leaned forward, her eyes glistening with tears. I don't want you to have to keep fighting, Dad. Not anymore. Samuel reached out and took her hand. The fight isn't over, Diane. It's just taken a different shape. And now, it's your turn to lead. The next morning, the story broke in the media. Headlines splashed across screens and newspapers. Elderly black man, father of mayor, detained by police in suspected racial profiling incident. The station phone rang off the hook. Journalists demanded statements. Activists planned protests. And the community's anger grew louder with each passing hour. Within the department, tensions simmered. Officers who sympathized with Patrick felt the pressure, while others quietly distanced themselves from him. Patrick sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. A sinking feeling of dread had been building in his chest since Diane's confrontation. He scrolled through the articles, each one condemning him as a symbol of everything wrong with policing. Jensen, barked his superior, Captain Morris, as he walked into the room. My office. Now. Patrick followed reluctantly. The captain sat behind his desk, pinching the bridge of his nose. Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've unleashed? Morris demanded. I didn't do anything wrong, Patrick argued. I followed procedure. Procedure? Morris's voice was incredulous. Your so-called procedure just put this entire department under a microscope. The mayor's breathing down our necks, the public's demanding answers, and we're one viral video away from a full-blown crisis. Patrick clenched his fists. I was just doing my job. Your job is to protect and serve, Morris snapped. Not to act on every baseless suspicion that pops into your head. The captain leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. Look, Jensen, I know you're a good cop, but you messed up. Big time. And you're going to have to face the consequences. As protests erupted outside the police station, Diane took to the podium at City Hall. Cameras flashed as she stepped forward, her expression somber but resolute. My father, Samuel Carter, is a man of integrity, a retired educator who has spent his life serving this community. The events of yesterday were unacceptable and highlight a systemic issue that we can no longer ignore. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I have spent my career fighting for justice and equality, and I will not allow this incident to be swept under the rug. I am calling for a full investigation into the practices of the New Haven Police Department, starting with Officer Patrick Jensen. The crowd erupted in cheers and chants of support. Inside the police station, Patrick watched the speech on a muted television. His chest tightened as Diane's words sank in. He had never considered himself part of the problem. But now the world seemed to disagree. The investigation began in earnest. Internal Affairs combed through Patrick's record, uncovering other complaints of misconduct. The media latched onto these stories, painting him as a symbol of systemic racism within the force. Patrick's name was now synonymous with controversy, and he felt the walls closing in. For Diane, the fight was just beginning. She met with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and even police reform advocates, building a coalition to address the root causes of incidents like her father's detention. But she knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. The media storm surrounding Patrick Jensen grew unbearable. Protesters gathered outside the police station daily, chanting slogans demanding accountability and justice. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForSamuel Carter and #ReformThePolice. Patrick avoided the news when he could, but it was impossible to escape the barrage of criticism. At home, Patrick sat in his dimly lit living room, nursing a drink as the voices of protesters echoed faintly through the cracked window. His phone buzzed incessantly, texts from friends offering support, colleagues urging him to lay low, and reporters seeking a comment. Patrick's frustration boiled over. "I was doing my job," he muttered to himself, slamming his glass onto the table. "They don't understand what it's like out there." He opened his laptop, scrolling through news articles and opinion pieces dissecting his actions. Some labeled him a racist. Others called him a symptom of a broken system. The comments were even worse, a mix of vitriol and calls for his resignation. Patrick's anger grew with every word he read. Later that night, he confided in his closest friend on the force, Officer Greg Mathers. The two met at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. "This whole thing is out of control," Patrick said, his voice low but charged with emotion. "They're making me out to be some kind of monster." Greg sighed, stirring his coffee. "You made a mistake, Pat. A big one. But you need to own up to it before this gets worse." "Own up to what?" Patrick snapped. "I didn't do anything wrong. That old man was acting suspicious. How was I supposed to know who he was?" Greg leaned in, his expression serious. "It's not about who he is. It's about how you treated him. You think this is just about one mistake? This is years of frustration from people who feel like they've been targeted and mistreated. And now, you're the face of that frustration." Patrick leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. He didn't want to hear it, but deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Greg was right. Meanwhile, Diane Carter was navigating the delicate balance of politics and personal pain. As mayor, she was expected to lead with composure and pragmatism. But as a daughter, the incident with her father had struck a deep nerve. In her office, Diane met with her senior advisors and members of the city council. The discussion centered around police reform, a topic that had become unavoidable in the wake of the scandal. "We need a plan," one of her advisors said. "Something concrete that shows we're addressing this. We also need to be careful not to alienate the police department." Another council member interjected. "They're already feeling under attack." Diane listened, her face impassive, but her mind was racing. She knew any reform would be met with resistance, from within the police force, from conservative constituents, and even from her own advisors. But she also knew the status quo was unacceptable. After the meeting, Diane called her father. She needed his wisdom, his steady perspective. "How are you holding up, Dad?" she asked. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Samuel replied. "How about you? I imagine this hasn't been easy." "It hasn't," Diane admitted. "Everyone's watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I want to do the right thing, but it feels like no matter what I do, someone's going to hate me for it." Samuel chuckled softly. "That's the burden of leadership, Diane. But remember, you're not in this alone. Lean on the people who care about you, and don't be afraid to stand firm in what you believe is right." His words bolstered her resolve. That evening, Diane began drafting a comprehensive plan for police reform, one that would address systemic issues while fostering dialogue between the police and the community. The next day, Diane reached out to Patrick through an intermediary. She wanted to meet with him, not as a mayor confronting a disgraced officer, but as a leader seeking understanding. Patrick was reluctant at first. He felt cornered, betrayed by the system he had served for so long. But curiosity and a sense of obligation ultimately drove him to agree. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a small conference room at City Hall. Patrick arrived first, his uniform neatly pressed but his nerves frayed. Diane entered a few minutes later, dressed in a tailored suit that exuded authority. "Officer Jensen," Diane greeted him, her tone calm but firm. "Mayor Carter," Patrick replied, standing awkwardly before sitting down. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history filling the room. "I wanted to speak with you directly," Diane began, "not as the mayor or the daughter of Samuel Carter, but as someone who believes in accountability and growth." Patrick shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure what you expect me to say." "I expect honesty," Diane said, "and I hope for understanding. Do you realize the impact of what you did? Not just on my father, but on the community as a whole?" Patrick hesitated. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't personal. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Diane echoed. "Do you think your job is to assume guilt based on appearances? To strip people of their dignity without cause?" Her words stung, but Patrick found himself reflecting on them. "I made a mistake," he admitted quietly. "I didn't think about how it would look, or how it would feel." Diane leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Mistakes are human, Officer Jensen, but what matters is how we choose to respond to them. Are you willing to take responsibility for yours?" Patrick nodded slowly, the first cracks in his defensive armor beginning to show. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to be part of the solution," Diane said. "Work with me to address these issues, to rebuild trust. You have a choice. Patrick, you can double down on your defensiveness, or you can help us make things better." While Diane and Patrick began their tentative steps toward reconciliation, the investigation into Patrick's conduct continued. Internal Affairs uncovered a troubling pattern: minority residents disproportionately targeted during Patrick's career. Complaints that had been dismissed or quietly buried. The findings were leaked to the press, sparking outrage. Protesters outside the station grew in number, their chants louder and more fervent. For Patrick, the revelations were a wake-up call. He had always justified his actions as part of the job, but now he couldn't ignore the patterns that painted a different picture. Diane used the momentum to push forward her reform plan. She held a town hall meeting, inviting community members to share their experiences and ideas. The event was tense but productive, with voices from all sides coming together in a rare moment of collective hope. Samuel Carter attended the meeting, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of what was at stake. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decades of experience. "We all have a role to play in building a better future," Samuel said. "It's not about erasing the past, but about learning from it. And that starts with listening, to each other and to our own hearts." The meeting ended with a sense of cautious optimism. Patrick watched from the back of the room, feeling a mix of shame and determination. For the first time, he began to see a path forward not just for himself, but for the community he had sworn to protect. Patrick Jensen's world continued to crumble as the investigation into his past actions came to a head. Internal Affairs officially released its findings. Over the years, Patrick had conducted a disproportionate number of traffic stops, searches, and arrests targeting minorities. While none of these incidents had escalated to violence, the pattern was undeniable. The report labeled it as evidence of implicit racial bias. The public reaction was swift and fierce. Protesters outside the station waved signs demanding Patrick's resignation, chanting slogans that echoed throughout the city. Social media exploded with calls for justice, with some demanding broader reforms to hold other officers accountable for similar actions. For Patrick, the worst blow came when his suspension was announced. Captain Morris called him into the office for what would be their final conversation as superior and subordinate. "Patrick, I'm sorry it's come to this," Morris began, his tone subdued. "But you've left me no choice. The public needs to see accountability, and the department needs to protect what little trust we have left." Patrick sat stiffly in the chair, his hands clenched into fists. "So, that's it? You're throwing me under the bus to save face?" Morris sighed heavily. "This isn't about saving face. This is about the choices you've made and the consequences of those choices. You've been a good officer in some ways, but this pattern of behavior, it can't be ignored." As Patrick left the captain's office, carrying the weight of his suspension, he felt an unfamiliar hollowness. He had always prided himself on being a man of authority, someone who upheld the law. Now, that image was shattered not just in the eyes of others, but in his own. While Patrick grappled with the fallout of his actions, Samuel Carter wrestled with his own feelings. Despite the humiliation he had suffered, Samuel wasn't a man to hold grudges. He had spent his life teaching others to rise above hatred and bitterness. But now, he found himself struggling to practice what he preached. One evening, Samuel sat on the porch of Diane's house, watching the sun set over the city. Diane joined him, her expression a mix of concern and weariness. "Dad," she said softly, "you've been quiet lately. What's on your mind?" Samuel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I've been thinking about that officer, Jensen. I can't get him out of my head." "You don't owe him anything," Diane replied, her voice firm. "He made his choices. He humiliated you, and now he's facing the consequences." "I know," Samuel said, "but holding on to anger, it's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I can't live like that." Diane frowned, her protective instincts flaring. "You don't have to forgive him, Dad. Not everyone deserves forgiveness." Samuel smiled faintly. "Forgiveness isn't about him. It's about me. And maybe, just maybe, it's about helping him see a different way." The next day, Samuel made a surprising decision. He would meet with Patrick face to face. Diane was hesitant but ultimately respected her father's choice. The meeting was arranged at a neutral location, a quiet community center. Patrick arrived first, dressed in civilian clothes. He looked different without his uniform, more vulnerable and less certain. His usual confidence had been replaced by an uneasy mixture of shame and apprehension. When Samuel entered the room, Patrick stood up awkwardly. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice stiff. I wasn't expecting this." Samuel nodded, taking a seat across from Patrick. "I imagine you weren't, but I thought it was important that we talk." Patrick looked down at his hands, unsure of what to say. "I don't know how to start." "Then let me start," Samuel said, his tone gentle but firm. "What you did to me was wrong. You judged me based on the color of my skin, not the content of my character. That's not something I can just forget." Patrick flinched but nodded. "I know, and I'm sorry. I really am. I don't know how to make it right." "You start by looking inward," Samuel replied. "You have to ask yourself why you see people the way you do. And then you have to make a choice. Are you going to let those biases define you? Or are you going to change?" Patrick's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I don't know if I can change. You can, Samuel said simply. But it won't be easy. It's a lifelong process. And it starts with humility. For the first time, Patrick allowed himself to truly feel the weight of his actions. He realized that Samuel's forgiveness wasn't a gift. It was a challenge to become a better man. The meeting with Samuel marked a turning point for Patrick. He began attending workshops and seminars on implicit bias, trying to unlearn the prejudices that had shaped his career. First, it was uncomfortable, even painful, to confront the truths about himself. But as he listened to the stories of those who had suffered because of systemic injustice, something inside him began to shift. Meanwhile, Diane pushed forward with her reform plan. She met with police leadership, community activists, and policy experts to draft a comprehensive set of changes. The reforms included mandatory bias training for all officers, the creation of a civilian oversight board, and stricter accountability measures for misconduct. At the heart of the reforms was a program designed to rebuild trust between the police and the community. Officers would participate in community engagement initiatives, spending time in neighborhoods not as enforcers, but as neighbors. Samuel played a key role in these efforts. He volunteered to lead discussions between officers and community members, sharing his own experiences and encouraging open dialogue. His calm, steady presence helped bridge the divide, turning anger into understanding. Patrick, now on unpaid leave, volunteered to join these discussions. First, the community members were skeptical, even hostile, but Patrick listened without defensiveness, acknowledging his mistakes and expressing a genuine desire to change. Over time, his sincerity began to win people over. By the end of the year, the city of New Haven had begun to heal. The reforms were far from perfect, and the wounds left by years of injustice wouldn't disappear overnight. But there was hope, a fragile but growing belief that change was possible. For Patrick, the journey was just beginning. He knew he could never undo the harm he had caused, but he was determined to spend the rest of his life trying to make amends. And for Samuel, watching this transformation was a reminder of the power of resilience, forgiveness, and the human capacity for growth. Months after the storm of controversy had erupted, New Haven was slowly finding its footing. The reforms initiated by Diane Carter were beginning to take shape. And while resistance remained in some corners, there was a palpable shift in the city's atmosphere. Patrick Jensen, now a civilian after officially resigning from the police force, had dedicated himself to community work. He began volunteering at a local youth center in one of New Haven's underserved neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods he had once patrolled with suspicion. At the youth center, Patrick initially faced cold stares and outright hostility. The kids, many of whom had experienced police harassment firsthand, recognized him as the officer who had detained Samuel Carter. They whispered behind his back, and some openly refused to engage with him. One afternoon, Patrick sat alone in the corner of the gym, watching as a group of teenagers played basketball. A boy named Malik, about 16 years old, approached him hesitantly. "Why are you even here?" Malik asked, his voice sharp. "You think you can just show up and fix everything?" Patrick looked up, his face tired but calm. "No," he admitted. "I can't fix what's already happened, but I can try to do better. And maybe, if I stick around long enough, I can show people that I've changed." Malik frowned, unconvinced. "Why should we trust you?" "You shouldn't," Patrick said simply. "Not yet, but I'm here, and I'm willing to prove myself, however long it takes." Over time, Patrick's consistent presence began to soften some of the resistance. He coached basketball games, helped kids with their homework, and listened to their stories without judgment. Slowly but surely, the walls began to come down. At City Hall, Diane Carter was deep in the process of implementing her long-term reform plan. The Civilian Oversight Board was up and running, and the first independent reviews of police conduct were underway. There were pushbacks. Of course, officers who felt betrayed, politicians who accused her of being anti-police, but Diane remained steadfast. One of her most ambitious initiatives was the Community Engagement Pilot Program. Under this program, police officers would spend time volunteering in neighborhoods, not as enforcers of the law, but as participants in community life. The idea was to rebuild trust by fostering genuine relationships. Diane knew this program would be controversial, but she also believed in its potential. To ensure its success, she decided to include community leaders and activists in its planning. Samuel Carter, ever the educator, played a crucial role in these meetings. During one such session, Samuel addressed a room filled with police officers and community members. "Trust isn't something you can demand," he said. "It's something you earn, and it takes time, effort, and consistency. If we're serious about healing this city, we have to be willing to put in the work, no matter how uncomfortable it gets." His words resonated deeply, even with the officers who had been skeptical of the program. Diane, watching her father speak, felt a surge of pride. He had always been her moral compass, and now he was helping guide an entire city toward a better future. Patrick's journey toward redemption faced its biggest test when he was invited to speak at a community forum organized by Diane. The forum was part of the ongoing efforts to promote dialogue between the police and the people they served. It was a chance for citizens to voice their grievances and for officers to listen, and, in some cases, apologize. Patrick hesitated when he received the invitation. He knew he would be stepping into a room filled with people who hated him, and he wasn't sure he could handle the confrontation. But after talking it over with Samuel, who encouraged him to face his past head-on, Patrick decided to accept. The night of the forum, the auditorium was packed. Tension hung heavy in the air as people took turns sharing their experiences with police misconduct. Some spoke through tears, recounting moments of fear and humiliation. Others spoke with anger, their voices rising as they demanded accountability. When Patrick's turn came, the room fell silent. He stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly. "My name is Patrick Jensen," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I used to be a police officer in this city, and I made mistakes, terrible mistakes." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on my actions, and I realize now how much harm I caused. To Mr. Carter, to the community, and to people I didn't even know I was hurting. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to say that I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then, from the back, Samuel Carter stood and began to clap. Slowly, others joined in. The applause wasn't loud or enthusiastic. It was tentative, a small but significant gesture of acknowledgement. For Patrick, it was enough. The following spring, New Haven held a citywide event to celebrate its progress and honor those who had contributed to the ongoing reforms. The event, titled Bridges to Tomorrow, was held in a sprawling park, with food stalls, music, and speeches from community leaders. Diane stood on the main stage, looking out at the diverse crowd that had gathered. She felt a deep sense of gratitude not just for the changes that had been made, but for the resilience and determination of the people who had made them possible. "Today," Diane said, addressing the crowd, "we celebrate not just what we've accomplished, but what we're building together. This isn't the end of our journey. It's the beginning, and I know that if we continue to work together, we can create a city where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." After her speech, Diane joined her father and Patrick at a table near the stage. Samuel was laughing with a group of young activists, his warmth and wisdom drawing people in as always. Patrick, now a fixture in the community, sat quietly, watching the festivities unfold. He still carried the weight of his past, but he also carried the hope of a better future, one he was committed to helping build. As the sun set over New Haven, casting the park in a golden glow, Diane looked around at the faces of her father, Patrick, and the community she loved. For the first time in a long time, she felt a profound sense of peace. The city still had a long way to go, but they had taken the first steps together. And that, Diane thought, was something worth celebrating.